On my 64th birthday, my son called from Vancouver to wish me well, then asked, "Dad, how are you settling into the condo? Is the view of the harbor everything you hoped for?" I stood in the corner of my daughter-in-law's basement, one hand pressed against the cold concrete wall to steady myself, and said, "What condo, son? I'm sleeping on a cot next to the furnace." The silence on his end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I had been 62 when my heart gave me trouble the first time. Nothing dramatic. I didn't collapse at work, or anything like that. I was shoveling the driveway of the house I'd owned for 31 years in Sudbury, and I felt a pressure in my chest like someone had placed a sandbag on it. My neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Kowalski, saw me sitting on the front step in the middle of February and called 911 before I even had a chance to wave her off. 2 stents and 6 weeks of cardiac rehab later, I was told I couldn't go back to the mine. 34 years as an underground electrician at Falconbridge, and just like that, it was done. The disability payments from the union were decent at first, but between the mortgage, the prescriptions, and the property taxes the city of Sudbury kept raising, I was bleeding money faster than I could see it happening. My son was doing well for himself in Vancouver. He'd gone out there for university and never come back, which I understood. There's not much pulling a young person back to Northern Ontario once they've tasted the coast. He'd married his wife about 4 years before all of this, and she was polished in the way that made me feel like I was always tracking mud in somewhere. Not unkind, exactly, just precise. The kind of person who counted things. When the calls from the bank started getting serious, I told my daughter-in-law about it. My son was in the middle of closing some kind of deal at the tech company he worked for, and she'd called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual. She said she wanted to check in. I told her the truth, that I was 3 months behind on the mortgage, that my CPP and disability together weren't covering it, and that I didn't know what I was going to do. She listened very carefully. She said she would speak to my son, and that we would figure something out together. She called herself family. I remember that word specifically. What followed, I only understood much later. She told my son I had everything managed, that I was planning to sell the house on my own terms and downsize, that I was actually excited about a fresh start. She sent him a photo of me standing in the front yard in July, smiling, holding a coffee mug. I was smiling because she'd asked me to. She said she wanted to send my son something to show him I was doing well so he wouldn't worry during the merger. I smiled because I was still hoping she was on my side. By September, the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings. My daughter-in-law helped me with the paperwork to dispute the timeline, bought me a few more months, and in that time told my son I had voluntarily sold the house and was transitioning to something smaller. She said I was looking forward to less upkeep. She said I'd told her I wanted my independence. By November, I was living in their basement, not in Vancouver. They had purchased a second property in Kelowna, an investment property, my son had called it, and my daughter-in-law managed it. She told my son I was renting a suite there, getting some mountain air, and keeping busy volunteering at the Legion. What I was actually doing was sleeping in the unfinished basement beneath tenants who paid rent that went directly into her account. She brought groceries once every 2 weeks. She told me it was temporary. She said the moment things stabilized, she would talk to my son about setting me up properly. She asked me, please, not to call him directly right now, because the merger stress was severe, and she was worried about his blood pressure. I believed her for longer than I should have. That's the part that still sits heavy. I split my Crestor pills in half because I couldn't afford the full prescription on what was left of my monthly payments after she deducted what she called living costs. I ate a lot of canned soup. There was a man upstairs, a young fellow from Winnipeg who'd moved out to work the orchards, and he used to knock on the basement door sometimes with extra food his girlfriend had cooked. He didn't ask questions. He just knocked and handed me a plate. My son called on weekends. My daughter-in-law would sometimes be in the background prompting him, and I could hear it. Those little steering sounds, the way she'd laugh at something he said to let him know the conversation was going fine, that nothing needed to be examined more closely. If I ever started to say something real, she'd interject. She was gifted at it. On my birthday, she wasn't there. My son called from his office in Vancouver. He'd taken the day off, he said, and he was feeling nostalgic. He asked how I was settling into the condo. I asked him what condo. He said, Dad, the one in Kelowna, the one we got you. Harbor View, 2 bedrooms. Well, I know Kelowna isn't ocean, but the lake view is supposed to be beautiful. He sounded confused in the way people do when reality doesn't match the map they've been given. She sent me the listing. She said you loved it when she showed you the photos. Said you cried a little, actually. I sat down on the edge of the cot. The furnace ticked. Upstairs, someone was walking back and forth across the kitchen floor. Son, I said, I'm in the basement. I told him everything, not all at once. I kept stopping, trying to find the right words that wouldn't make him feel like the ground was moving. But there was no gentle way to say it. His wife had taken whatever money he'd sent for my housing, had told him I was living in comfort while I was rationing medication in an unfinished basement, and had been managing both of us for the better part of 2 years like pieces on a board she was the only one who could see. He went very quiet. Then he said, "How much did I send her?" I didn't know. I told him I didn't know. I never knew money had been sent at all. He hung up. He called back 11 minutes later and told me to pack whatever I had. He was flying to Kelowna the next morning. He arrived looking like someone had aged him 5 years overnight. He knocked on the basement door himself. He hadn't known there was a basement door, hadn't known the layout of the property his wife managed, hadn't asked because she'd handled everything. He walked in and stood there looking at the cot, and the hot plate, and the prescription bottles I'd lined up on an overturned cardboard box, because there was no shelf space. And he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "She told me you wanted to be independent, that you'd asked her not to fuss." "That's what I thought you believed," I told him. "That's what made it work." The conversation with his wife happened that afternoon, over video call, because she was still in Vancouver. My son had found the bank transfer records on his laptop before he'd left. $42,000 he'd sent over 18 months, earmarked in the memo lines with notes like Dad's housing and Dad's medical top-up. He'd pulled the thread and found more threads. She started with the explanation I'd been expecting. He'd been under so much pressure, she'd only been trying to protect him. She'd meant it to be temporary. She said she'd been planning to tell him, that she was waiting for the right time. She said I had been difficult to help, that I'd been proud and resistant, that she'd done the best she could with a complicated situation. My son asked her where the money had gone. She said it was in savings. She said it was earning interest for my future. He told her he wanted the account statements, all of them. That's when her voice changed. She said he was being irrational, that this was a family matter and not a courtroom, that if he kept pushing like this, he was going to do damage that couldn't be undone. She said she was pregnant. The word landed the way those words always do, like a stone thrown into a conversation that changes the shape of everything around it. My son went pale. I watched him on the screen of his laptop because he'd propped it so I could hear, and I saw him sit down slowly. I won't pretend I didn't feel the weight of it. This was my grandchild. That part was real, regardless of everything else. But I'd lived in a basement for long enough to know what it felt like, when someone used something you loved to keep you from asking questions. My son took 3 days. He drove back to Vancouver, met with a family lawyer on Robson Street, a woman his colleague had recommended, and went through the accounts with her. The full picture came out methodically, the way these things always do when someone finally starts looking. The $42,000 had been moved into a joint account she'd opened in her name and her sister's. There were transfers to a renovation company that belonged to her sister's husband. There were charges to a resort in Tofino, a flight to Portugal, clothing purchases that totaled more than I had spent on myself in the previous decade combined. Not all of it was recoverable. Some of it was simply gone. But some of it wasn't. When my son confronted her with the statements, she pivoted hard. She said she had been contributing to this family in ways that weren't valued. She said managing his father, managing his stress, managing their life while he focused on his career had been an invisible labor that deserved compensation. She said the money was, in a sense, owed to her. He called me that night after she'd gone to stay at her sister's. She said you were lucky, he told me. She said older people in your situation end up much worse, and that I should be grateful she kept you housed at all. I let that sit for a moment. Housed. That was the word she'd used. Like I was a problem she'd managed rather than a person she'd chosen to deceive. "What are you going to do?" I asked my son. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to make sure you're okay first," he said. "And then I'm going to make sure she can't do this to anyone else." He moved me out of that basement within the week. He found a furnished 1-bedroom in Kelowna while things were sorted out legally, and he paid for it himself from his own account with a transfer he confirmed with me on the phone while he was making it. He drove up on the weekend to help me get settled. He brought groceries and a new prescription card, and he sat at my kitchen table for the first time in years, and we just talked. Not around things, not carefully, just talked the way we used to when he was young. He told me he'd tried to call more, that there had been a stretch, maybe 8 months, when he'd called my old cell number and gotten a disconnected message. He'd asked her about it, and she'd said I had switched carriers and was having trouble with the new phone, that she was helping me sort it out. He'd sent me a Christmas card to the Sudbury address and received a note back, in handwriting he now realized wasn't mine, saying I was well and busy. I told him about the hospital. Last March, I'd had another episode. Not as serious as the first. The paramedics said I'd caught it early. But I spent 2 nights in Kelowna General. I'd called her from the hospital and asked her to tell my son. I told her the doctor wanted to speak with a family member. I told her I was scared. She had told me he was at a conference in Toronto and that she would handle it. She'd called the hospital herself, identified herself as my emergency contact, received the information from the nurse, and told them not to call my son because she was in contact with him and would coordinate. Then she drove to Kelowna the following day, brought me a bag of groceries, and told me I looked much better than she'd expected. She had never told my son. When I told him this, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, very carefully, "Dad, I need you to tell me one more thing. Is there anything else I don't know?" I thought about it. I told him about the prescription splitting. I told him about the Christmas I'd spent alone in that basement because she'd told him I was visiting a friend in Thunder Bay. I told him about the morning I'd sat on the concrete floor with my back against the furnace because my chest hurt, and I wasn't sure if it was serious and I had no one to call. He cried. He tried to hide it, but he cried. I told him it wasn't his fault. I meant it. I had watched this woman work, had watched how carefully she'd placed every piece, and I knew that the deception was skilled enough that most people would have missed it. My son is a good man. He trusted his wife. That's not a character flaw. The legal process took several months. The family lawyer was straightforward. There was a solid basis for civil action around the misappropriated funds, and the documented pattern of isolation and financial control met the threshold that BC lawyers call financial elder abuse. The pregnancy complicated the separation in the way pregnancies always do. Child support, custody arrangements, the question of my son's role in a child's life when the other parent had done what she'd done. He chose to stay involved. I supported that. Whatever she was, the child hadn't chosen her. She made one attempt to reach me directly. She drove to Kelowna after she'd been served with the separation papers and knocked on my apartment door. I opened it because I heard the knock, and I'm not the kind of man who pretends he's not home. She stood in the hallway looking smaller than I remembered her. She asked if she could come in. I told her she could stand in the doorway. She said she was sorry. She said she'd made choices that she regretted and that she'd been frightened and that fear had made her do things she wouldn't otherwise have done. She placed her hand on her stomach the way people do when they want you to think about the baby. She said she hoped that for the child's sake we could find a way to move past this. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, I spent 14 months in that basement. I split my heart medication in half. I ate soup out of a can on Christmas Day. And you came to Kelowna to bring me groceries and tell me I looked good. I kept my voice level. That wasn't fear. That was a choice. You made it a lot of times. She started to say something. I'll be in this child's life if my son asks me to be, I said, but I won't stand here and be asked to make your conscience feel better about what you did. I closed the door gently, not in anger, just closed it. The settlement was finalized the following spring. The money that was recoverable was recovered, along with enough in damages that my son was able, finally, to buy me the place he'd always meant to. Not in Kelowna. We both agreed on that. Too many months of staring at those mountains from a basement window had changed how I felt about the view. We settled on a small city in the interior of BC, about 2 hours from Vancouver, close enough for my son to drive without it being an event, far enough that we both had our own lives. The place he found me is a ground-floor unit in a building that backs onto a park, and I have a small patio where I've started keeping tomatoes and a few herbs in containers. After 34 years underground, I find I can't get enough of things that grow toward the sun. My son's daughter was born in October. He calls her his daughter, plainly, without any of the hesitation I'd feared. He drives out to see me most weekends, and sometimes he brings her with him. She's 8 months old now, and she looks at everything with the absolute confidence of someone who has never been given a reason not to trust the world. He set up a proper video call schedule with her mother. It's formal and documented the way things have to be when trust is gone. He's civil about it. I know it costs him something to be that civil, and I know he does it because of her. There's a man in my building, a retired history teacher from Prince George, who lost his wife a few years back and who has taken to knocking on my door on Sunday mornings with fresh coffee from the bakery down the street. We sit on my patio and argue about hockey and whether the current federal government understands anything about the North. He doesn't ask me much about my past, and I don't ask much about his. We're both at an age where the present is more interesting anyway. My son came by last Sunday. He brought the baby and a bag of pea-meal bacon from a market he knows I like. We made breakfast together in my kitchen, the three of us, the baby propped in her carrier on the counter, watching us with great seriousness while we figured out where I kept the spatula. At one point, he looked up from the stove and said, "Dad, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly." I told him to go ahead. "Are you happy?" I thought about the basement. I thought about the cot and the furnace and the split pills and the Christmas soup. I thought about the morning in the hospital in March when I'd held the phone and wanted to call my son and believed I couldn't. I looked at my kitchen, the light coming through the patio door, the tomatoes in their containers, the baby watching the spatula like it might do something interesting, my son waiting for an answer. "Yeah," I said, "I think I actually am." He nodded. He turned back to the stove, and that was enough. That was exactly enough.